Yeah, thanks. So today we'll talk about a recent study that we did about the moon and suicide. And it's a case in point example of debunking a likely false positive finding. So let me start a little story here. It was right after the first lockdown where I had a chance to recover from a really difficult situation in my clinic where we changed to a COVID specific department. So I had a few days rest here and this nice little house at the Czechian border. And I came across this study. This was a Finnish study. And in these studies, they found an increase of suicides during full moon in the region of Oulu, which is in the northern part of Finland. However, it turned out that this finding was only in winter among women and only among younger women. This was not just some journal that this study appeared, but it was a top journal, the Journal of Molecular Psychiatry, which belongs now to the Nature group. So for any serious researcher, some red flags will appear. Here you see the results in more detail. This was the main finding. So here in winter, among the female group, there was a percentage of 40 of suicides during the full moon quarter. That's more than the expected 25%. And this was then in a regression analysis close to being statistically significant, and it translates to an incidence risk ratio of 1.35. So it's a 35% increase of suicides in the full moon quarter in winter among the female subgroup. So, of course, some questions arose. There was no protocol for this study. It was not known if the subgroups were pre-specified or not. So you could argue how to create the age groups, the 4 seasons, or the moon phases. For example, you could use a more fine-grained definition of moon phases. So it clearly was an exploratory study. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's known that there is a risk for p-hacking and hacking, hypothesizing after the results are known. So what was not discussed in the paper, and this was some surprise, that this could be a false positive results that needs a replication. Moreover, this is problematic because most of the previous studies found nearly perfect null effects, and in a meta-analysis, this was put to rest already in 1985 because across the studies there was a perfect zero effect. So in this nice little house, I had access to the Austrian data set, which was much larger, and I thought, let's replicate and write a letter. So here you see the results for the Austrian study that was much larger, nearly 80,000 suicides compared to 2,600 in the Finnish study. As expected, there was a null finding. So the observed percentage of suicides in the full moon quarter was 26% with a sharp confidence interval. And this was, of course, not statistically significant. What was interesting is that there were 4 reviewers for this letter. It was just submitted as a letter. There were 4 reviewers and 3 rounds of review. And then, of course, a response by the original authors. The main criticism for our study was that you cannot compare Austria, which is here, to Finland and Oulu, which is far northern than Austria. So the differences in the shortest day and the longest night in winter is quite substantial between the two areas. It was also discussed that there might be differences in vitamin D levels, or there's a difference in nightly artificial brightness between Austria and Finland. But it was not explained why this should only affect young women. And then there was some strange argumentation, like 3 competent and independent reviewers regarded the statistical conclusions as reliable and correct, or it's necessary to guard against the well-documented reluctance to embrace novel suggestions, ideas, and findings that depart from conventions, referring to the famous Semmelweis reflex. And even one ad hominem attack. So one cannot help but get the impression that some conflict of interest has been involved, and to this day, I don't know how's my conflict of interest with the moon. So I had the chance that I could collaborate with Swedish colleagues from Karolinska, and they had access to the whole Swedish suicide register. And so we did a replication study using the Swedish data with nearly 50,000 suicides, so well powered. We set up a protocol beforehand that we published before doing any analysis. And what was really cool for me, I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist, but I am also fond of R. So they had no access to the data. I had no access to the data, but they had. And they had no resources for do the programming, but I had. So I sent them the R code, and I only got the results back. So it was kind of really controlling the statistical analysis. No tricks. And we also tested some suggested moderators like latitude and nightly brightness. Here you see the map of Sweden and each district, each municipality of Sweden with a different nightly brightness. And we did some sensitivity analysis. So it turned out, again, not very surprising, that we had a close to zero effect. So the observed percentage of suicides during the full moon quarter among the young women was 23%. This was, again, not statistically significant. We found this for the full sample, for the northern part of Sweden, for the very northern part of Sweden, for municipalities with darker nights. And there was one exception, that there were fewer suicides among premenopausal women in the northern part of Sweden. But of course, when you run so many statistical tests, each 20th test will turn out statistically significant. So after correction for alpha, this was not statistically significant anymore. So for a discussion, the question arises if such interesting findings are still too easy to publish. It's a well-known problem in the publication process. Or do reviewers sufficiently consider problematic research practices? So we may wonder if there are critical eyes only on exotic topics like moon and suicide or quackery. And is there the same rigor for more plausible research questions? So we know from psychology, we have a big replication crisis. So what about medicine? And in my opinion, it's just starting there to take replication and also reproducibility seriously. And a positive surprise that the publication of the replication was possible. It's known that this is usually not so easy and that null effects are difficult to publish. So we expected a desk rejection, but in fact it was accepted in the first round. And I'd want to close with a happy end. The first author then contacted me back channel, and he said he finds the results convincing. So chapeau for this openness to change his mind. Well, thank you.